I'm Sarah Bowie. I'm the director of the Higgins School of Humanities and the Difficult Dialogues Initiative. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first major event in our Fall Dialogue Symposium on the end of things, death, extinction, renewal, and to welcome eminent cultural historian Morris Berman to Clark. Before I introduce Morris, though, I want to appreciate, first of all, your willingness to join in a difficult conversation. Death, endings, decline. As a culture, we prefer to avoid these topics, these conversations, even these experiences. And yet, our popular culture is increasingly generating stories and images of just those experiences. Witness the surge of dystopian and post-apocalyptic books and films. As if unconsciously we're trying to make sense of our culture and our world and the forces at work on them. Of course, these are perennial realities: death, extinction, impermanence, ones that we all know and will know, and that give life its dimensionality and its meaning. And yet, there's something more that we're also trying to point to in our work together this fall. We're suggesting that these are times when some endings may be different, more systemic, and more collectively consequential. And we're trying to see better what's happening and to talk truthfully among ourselves about it. To do that, we've asked a number of people, Morris included, to come and join us in this conversation, to bring different insights and angles to it. Some of those include the president of the ACLU, who will be talking about the decline of our civil liberties. The mounting extinction of languages will be addressed by anthropologist David Harrison. We have a lot of H's. Or the mounting crisis in climate change will be addressed by Elizabeth Kolbert, the journalist, and climate scientist Susie Moser. So I have, just to remind you, that the calendar of our events for this semester is in the back. You can take a copy. You're more than welcome. There's also a crib sheet that we have that's a little easier to carry around. So please help yourself to those documents. Tonight, I am delighted and honored to welcome Morris Berman, who will talk about the decline of our culture, of American culture, and his understanding of the historical and philosophical underpinnings of that decline. Morris is well known as an innovative cultural historian and social critic. He earned his BA in mathematics at Cornell and his PhD in the history of science at the Johns Hopkins University. He's taught in a number of universities, including the University of New Mexico and Catholic University, among others, and he was the Lansdowne Professor in the History of Science at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. He has written extensively, offering rigorous scholarship and deeply researched insights in a very accessible style. I myself came to know Morris's work many years ago. It seems like another world, actually, when his pioneering book, The Reenchantment of the World, a study of how the scientific worldview separates us from sensual and sustainable participation in the natural world, gave us a vision of how that could be different. It inspired and heartened me in my own work on those issues. Most recently, he's published a powerful trilogy that looks at the forces behind the decline of American society and preeminence, and his sense of its inevitability given our history and our values as a culture. In 2000, the first book of the series, The Twilight of American Culture, was named a notable book by the New York Times Book Review. It was followed by Dark Ages America in 2006 and Why America Failed in 2011. Morris's work is both challenging and liberating, giving voice to much that needs to be said and seen. As a young journalist wrote to Morris recently, "I've learned a great deal from your work, and in addition to finding it instructive, I've found it thought-provoking but inspiring. It may seem odd given its bleak but correct outlook. I find the truth, however, and your willingness to express it without equivocation or apology empowering, and I hope you will find that to be the case as well. Tonight, Morris tells me he's going to share the thesis of why America failed, and then go on beyond that to give us some ideas about where we may go from here. Please join me in welcoming Morris Berman.
Thank you all for coming. Are we having fun yet? Good, good. This is well, I wanted to start out by thanking the Higgins Center for inviting me, especially Sarah Bowie for extending the invitation so I could be here today. As she referred to at the end, this is actually two talks. Before you run out of the room, I will not be speaking for 2 hours. But Sarah wanted me particularly to talk about the book Why America Failed, and and I'm going to. That's the first talk, and it's just basically an overview of that book. And then I wanted to talk about a larger issue than the one I addressed in that trilogy. In the trilogy, I was really talking about the collapse of the United States, which we're all living through right now. But I want to talk about a larger. These are nested things, and the thing that holds that is the collapse of capitalism, also within our own time. I will be around for the final collapse of the United States, but I will not probably be around for the final collapse of capitalism. Some of you may be. It'll take most of this century to work itself out, I think. That's nested in an even larger issue, which I'll just refer to briefly at the end, and that's the collapse of modernity itself. So we are in a rather gigantic transitional period, I think. And so, anyway, let me start with the issue of the overview of why America failed, and then I'll switch to the issue of capitalism, which is called the waning of the modern ages. In terms of, after I finish the first one, if you guys want to ask questions at that point, that's fine. If you just want me to continue on and save those questions to the end of the whole thing, we can do that as well. Whatever you feel comfortable with, or whatever the energy is for it. As far as why America failed, I got the book is the third in a series of a trilogy on the decline of the American empire, and I got the idea for the third book. A number of sources. One of the most important was a book written by Walter McDougall at the University of Pennsylvania, also a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, that he published in 2004 called Freedom Just Around the Corner. And I want to stress that McDougall is a very centrist historian. He's not a wild-eyed radical like myself, out of control and so on, not at all. But in the opening pages of his book, he does say that what most characterizes the settlers of the North American continent, what's now referred to as the United States and Canada, going back to the late 16th century when that process first began, is the phenomenon of hustling. In other words, he says, to take a very strong and obvious example, American English has more than 200 synonyms or related expressions for the word swindle. 200. What's the thing about Eskimos have 90 words for snow? Because, for us it's con games. And he says when two Americans get together, they pretty much understand that the other person has an angle and is trying to sell them something. And, of course, they're trying to sell them something. And we call this dialogue, you see. He says, finally, what characterizes Americans is that there are people relentlessly on the make. That's what, is the spine here. And, we're all encouraged to develop the brand called you and market it and so on. All this reminds me of a comment that the comedian Chris Rock once made. He said, in the United States, when you're talking to another person, you're actually talking to that person's agent. It gets pretty depressing after a while, Americans don't, by and large, realize what a strange and, in fact, perverse way that is to live. If everybody's doing it, it just becomes normal. But the historian Paul Fussell, in his book Class, has a very low opinion of this supposedly normal way of life. In the United States, he writes, everything is coated with a fine layer of fraud. I suspect most Americans experience the truth of this on some level. And I think it's why we always tend to rate low on those international happiness surveys. Americans are not happy individuals. And this shows up when on these surveys that we rate low on those. I would say that the reason for that is that very few of our relationships are real, including our relationship to our work, and consequently our lives are pretty empty. We attempt to fill that emptiness with houses and cars and Facebook and iPads and cell phones, and see a number of people are consulting us. All the time we have to do this sort of thing. It's really frightening in a certain way, really frightening. One of Jimmy Carter's advisors put it 33 years ago. He said, the United States is a goal-oriented society without goals. And more, which is really the purpose of hustling, acquire more and more and more, is not a real goal. It has no content to it at all. The original title of Why America Failed was Capitalism and Its Discontents. It's very appropriate because Freud was here 103 years ago, and that's a very Freudian title. But my American publisher was afraid that with a title like that, I'd sell about 6 copies, Of course, I haven't done much better, I have to say, so I should have stayed with the original title. But I liked the title because Capitalism and Its Discontents really reflected the content of the book, or the thesis of the book, that although there was always an alternative tradition to hustling, with one exception, the United States never took it. And instead, what it did was marginalize all those alternative voices. And if you want an explanation for why we failed, it's because we never listened to the people that were trying to teach us something very important. Instead, we just continued hustling, and that was the dominant culture. The exception that I referred to was the antebellum South, which raises real questions as to the origins of the Civil War, which were, in fact, not about slavery as a moral issue, no matter how much Americans like to believe that. But the British historian Robert Blackburn wrote in a recent book, The American Crucible, that anti-slavery ideas were really about notions of progress, not about notions of racial equality. That's a whole other discussion, however, and I have it out in one chapter of the book. But the main narrative here is that from Captain John Smith and the Puritan divines in the 17th century, through Thoreau and Emerson, Lewis Mumford, Vance Packer, John Kenneth Galbraith, right down to Jimmy Carter, this tradition of capitalism's discontents never really stood a chance. It never amounted to anything more than spiritual exhortation. Reaganomics, which is also known as greedism, was not in fact born in 1980. A much more realistic estimate would be about 1584. The result is that for more than 4 centuries now, the American continent, what became the United States, has had one value system. And it's finally showing itself to be extremely lopsided and self-destructive. Our political and cultural system never let fresh air in. It squelched the alternatives as quaint or feeble-minded. So appearances to the contrary, this is what democracy has always meant in the United States. It's the freedom to become rich. This ideology is so powerful that we don't even recognize it as such, but it certainly explains why socialism was never able to gain a foothold in the United States, because the ideology has been the same for rich and poor alike. The result is that we're now in a situation of irreversible collapse. The American dream is quite a twisted one. These conventions, they're always talking about restoring the American dream. That's the last thing we need to do. It's really a twisted dream. Americans regard Bill Gates as some kind of national hero. The truth is that any system that allows one person to amass $50 billion and leaves 2/3 of the nation living from paycheck to paycheck, assuming that you can even find a job anymore, is a pretty sick system. And it's no great secret that in terms of collective wealth, the top 1% of the country owns more than the bottom 90%. Even the phrase, the bottom 90%, think of that. I mean, how do you have a bottom 90%, you know? This puts, statistically, this puts American social inequality on a par with Egypt and Tunisia and with Mexico, where I live, which the U.S. has the audacity to call a failed state. Consider the fact that every religion, every civilization worth the name, has as its central tenet the notion that you are in fact your brother's keeper. But the hustling way of life enshrines just the opposite. It says that virtue consists of personal success in an opportunistic environment, and that if you can take advantage of the other guy on your way to the top, more power to you. Looking out for number one, rather than in God we trust, is what really needs to be printed on the American dollar. That would be the appropriate slogan. As Jerry Seinfeld's lawyer in the final episode of the famous television series tells him, you don't have to help anybody. That's what this country's all about. The problem is that if you live by the dollar, you die by the dollar, which is what's happening today. In fact, perhaps the really interesting question is not why the United States is finally coming apart, which strikes me as being more or less obvious, but how it managed to stay together for so long. Competition cannot be the glue of a society because by definition it's an anti-glue. Thus, the American biologist David Ehrenfeld recently wrote, a society driven mainly by selfish individualism has all the potential for sustainability of a collection of angry scorpions in a bottle. There is a story, and it's probably apocryphal. I mean, it's repeated in many, many places, but I can't guarantee as an historian that's really true. But the story is of an American Indian scouting expedition that came across the starving members of the Donner Party in 1847. These folks were snowbound in the Sierra Nevadas, just to the east of California, and they resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. The expedition, these people had never seen white folks before, and they observed the Donner Party, the reconnaissance mission observed the Donner Party at a distance, and then they returned to base camp to report what they had seen. And the report consisted of 4 words: they eat each other. And frankly, if I could summarize the argument of why America failed in a single phrase, this would be it. Unless some socio-political movement manages to turn things around in a fundamental way, which I regard as terribly unlikely, they ate each other is going to be our epitaph. You know. Another version of this is the observation of Sitting Bull: possessions are a disease with them. Well, as I fully anticipated, why America failed. There's a shock. It got virtually no reviews in the United States. Sales of the book were negligible. My plans for a down payment on a villa in Tuscany cruelly dashed, you know. And all in all, it remains largely invisible on the American scene. You won't find it in bookstores or anything like that. If you do order it, it comes in a plain brown envelope. You know, this was to be expected because unless you're singing in the chorus, you don't get to have a voice. Those are the rules in the United States. The fact is that, I just received today, actually, an email from some journalist who, much to my amazement, got to do a review of it for Truth Out, which is going to appear in October. And he wrote that he had written a number of so-called progressive, what a joke that is, so-called progressive websites trying to get this review published. And all of them said, we won't publish it unless you add 2 or 3 paragraphs saying why the book is wrong and why America has a great future. So much for freedom of the press and being open-minded and stuff like that. What if America isn't so great? What if it doesn't have a great future? Maybe that's even possible, you know. But that he would have all these rejections. What happened to Truth Out? I don't know. Maybe they were drunk that day and, let it go, you know, something. I don't know. But anyway, it will appear. The fact is that any writer who formulates a critique of the United States that's fundamental, that really goes down to the root of things, is simply pushed off the radar screen. Those are the rules. The U.S. has very little appetite for self-examination, as our history demonstrates quite clearly. But there is a bit of irony, for me anyway, in this, in that the line of analysis developed in the book has some very distinguished antecedents, going way back before, let's say, a figure like Walter McDougall. These antecedents include, Gesundheit, three of the greatest historians that the United States has ever produced. One is Richard Hofstadter, whose classic work, The American Political Tradition, appeared in 1948, and which says that America was a market-oriented society from birth, that it never went through a feudal period, and that the result is that all of the country has been united in a common political tradition that's fiercely capitalistic and individualistic. A democracy of cupidity, where Hofstadter referred to the United States. America doesn't have ideologies, he added. Rather, it is one. Second figure is C. Vann Woodward, Southern historian, in an essay written in 1953, in which he refers to the, quote, ironic contrast between our noble purposes and our sordid results, and adds that economic systems, whatever their age, their respectability, or their apparent stability, are transitory, and any nation which elects to stand or fall upon one ephemeral institution, for example, laissez-faire capitalism, has already determined its fate. Finally, Lewis Hartz, in The Liberal Tradition in America in 1955, developed the idea of what he called fragment societies, ones that, like the United States, were founded on fragments of European ones and take their entire character from just one of those fragments. America, he says, was founded by the English middle class, a class that possessed an aggressive, entrepreneurial spirit that is characteristic of the bourgeoisie. The United States, wrote Hartz, was never really a society at all, but merely the embodiment of a fragment, a specific interest that from the first dominated the entire political landscape. What does the phrase, we the people, that begins the U.S. Constitution really mean, after all? We the people what? The business of America, as Calvin Coolidge famously remarked nearly a century ago, is business. In the history of the United States, nothing much really mattered. Nothing much else. And that chicken is finally coming home to roost now. If you can't or won't understand your own narrative and insist on marginalizing the voices that seek to explain it, then there is no way you can change that narrative. And there exists very little evidence today that Americans will or are mildly interested in it. Americans never learn, wrote Gore Vidal a few decades ago. It's part of our charm. Thank you. Okay, so that's the first part, just specifically devoted to the issue of the collapse of the United States. Unless there's burning questions on your part, I can move on to the part of capitalism in general. All right, let me move on then. So this is called The Waning of the Modern Ages. And I start out by talking about, it's a French phrase, la longue durée, the long run. This was an expression that was made popular by the Annales School of French historians, led by Fernand Braudel, who coined the phrase in 1958. The basic argument of the Annales School is that the proper concern of historians should be the analysis of structures that lie at the base of contemporary events. In other words, underneath short-term events such as individual cycles of economic boom and bust, or who's running for president this year, as if that mattered, we can discern the persistence, quote, of old attitudes of thought and action, resistant frameworks dying hard, at times against all logic. An important derivative of the Annales School is the work of what's called the World Systems Analysis School. And this includes Immanuel Wallerstein in the United States and Christopher Chase Dunn in England, which similarly focuses on long-term structures, capitalism in particular. Now, the arc of capitalism, think of a time frame. Okay, the arc of capitalism is about 600 years long. It starts around 1500, is going to finish up around 2100. It's our particular fortune, or many would say misfortune, to be living through the beginning of the end, the disintegration of capitalism as a world system. It was mostly commercial capital in the 16th century, evolving into industrial capital in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then moving on to financial capital, which is money created by money itself, especially by speculation in currency, in the 20th and 21st. In dialectical fashion, it'll be the very success of the system that eventually does it in. The last time a change of this magnitude occurred in Western history was during the 14th and 15th centuries, during which time the medieval world began to come apart and be replaced by the modern one. In his classic study of the period, The Waning of the Middle Ages, the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga depicted the time as one of depression and cultural exhaustion. So if you guys have been feeling depressed lately, you're right on target. Okay. You know, like our own times, it just wasn't much fun to live through. And one reason for this is that the world is literally perched over an abyss. That's what's happening today. What lies ahead is largely unknown. You must feel this in your bones. I mean, I'm guessing. And to have to hover over an abyss for a long time is frankly a bit of a drag. The same thing was true at the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire as well, on the ruins of which the feudal system eventually arose. Well, I was musing on these issues some time ago when I happened to run across what I felt was a remarkable essay by Naomi Klein. Some of you may know her work. She did a book called The Shock Doctrine. I don't know if you see some heads nodding. So it's a great book. And the essay was called Capitalism versus the Climate and was published last November in The Nation. And it was something, well, appeared to me to be a kind of radical shift for her. Because in that essay, she chastises the left for not understanding what the right does correctly perceive, that the whole climate change debate is a serious threat to capitalism. The left, she says, wants to soft-pedal the implications. It wants to say that environmental protection is compatible with economic growth, that it's not a threat to capital or labor. It wants to get everybody to buy a hybrid car, for example, which I've personally compared to eating diet cheesecake. It wants us to use more efficient light bulbs or recycle, as if those things were going to seriously make a difference for the economy, you know. But the right is not fooled. It sees green as a Trojan horse for red. The attempt, quote, to abolish capitalism and replace it with some kind of eco-socialism. It believes correctly that the politics of global warming is inevitably an attack on the American dream, on the whole capitalist structure. So Larry Bell, in his book Climate of Corruption, argues that environmental politics is essentially about transforming the American way of life in the interests of global wealth distribution. And the British writer James Dellenpole notes that modern environmentalism successfully advances many of the causes dear to the left: redistribution of wealth, higher taxes, greater government intervention, and regulation. So what Naomi is saying to the left is something like this: why fight it? Gesundheit. These nervous Nellies on the right are in fact right. Those of us on the left simply can't keep talking about the compatibility of limits to growth and unrestrained greed, or claiming that climate change is just one issue on a laundry list of worthy causes vying for progressive attention, or urging everyone to buy a Prius. Commentators like Thomas Friedman or Al Gore, who, quote, assure us that we can avert catastrophe by buying green products and creating clever markets and pollution, corporate green capitalism, in a word, are simply living in denial. I don't know if any of you are, that was a big favorite of mine, the sitcom by Tina Fey called 30 Rock. Anybody ever seen that? Early on, maybe it was 2008, there was one episode called Greenzo, which you can probably screen it by downloading it from Hulu.com or something like that. But this was one of my favorites. The Alec Baldwin character says to Tina Fey, who's his personal assistant, NBC is going green, and do you know why? And she says, to save the earth? He says, no, to drain it of its remaining resources. And the Greenzo character is played by David Schwimmer, who runs around in a green cape, you know, and comes out with phrases like saving the earth while maintaining corporate profitability. You know, it's a great show. You know, she's quite talented. At the end, Alec Baldwin and David Schwimmer get into this big fight, and the large plastic earth they have on the stage catches fire, and as it burns up, you hear Tina's voice saying, "This earth is ruined. We need a new earth." Like that. So anyway, Naomi writes, the real solutions to the climate crisis are also our best hope of building a much more enlightened economic system, one that closes deep inequalities, strengthens and transforms the public sphere, generates plentiful, dignified work, and radically reins in corporate power. Between the second volume in that series, which was Dark Ages America, and the third volume, Why America Failed, I published a collection of essays called A Question of Values. And I'm always encouraging people to read this because it contains material about the psychic underpinnings of the United States that you won't find in the other books. And one of the essays is called Conspiracy versus Conspiracy in American History. And in that essay, I lay out some of the unconscious programs buried in the American psyche from our earliest days, programs that account for most of America's so-called conscious behavior. These include the notion of an endless frontier, a world without limits, and the ideal of extreme individualism, that you do not need and should not need anyone's help to, quote, make it in the world. Combined, the two of these provide a formula for enormous capitalist power and inevitable capitalist collapse. Of this, Naomi Klein writes, the expansionist, extractive mindset, which has so long governed our relationship to nature, is what the climate crisis calls into question so fundamentally. The abundance of scientific research showing we have pushed nature beyond its limits does not just demand green products and market-based solutions. It demands a new civilizational paradigm, one grounded not in dominance over nature, but in respect for cultural cycles of renewal, and acutely sensitive to natural limits. These are profoundly challenging revelations for all of us raised in the Enlightenment ideal of progress. I have to say this is exactly what I argued 31 years ago in The Reenchantment of the World, and it's kind of interesting for me to see this all coming around now. Real climate solutions, she continues, are ones that steer government interventions to systematically disperse and devolve power and control to the community level. Through community-controlled renewable energy, local organic agriculture, or transit systems genuinely accountable to their users. Hence, she concludes, the powers that be have reason to be afraid and to deny the data on global warming, because what is really required at this point is the end of the free market ideology. And I would add the end of the arc of capitalism that I referred to earlier. It's going to be a colossal fight. It is a colossal fight. Not only because the powers that be want to hang on to their power and their money, but also because the arc and all of its ramifications have given their class meaning with a capital M for more than 500 years. This is what the Occupy Wall Street protesters, if there are any left at this point, I'm not sure, need to tell the 1%. Your lives are a mistake. This is what a new civilizational paradigm finally means. But I have to add that it needs to be said that almost everyone in the United States, not just that upper 1%, buys into this. Years ago, many years ago, John Steinbeck said that the reason that socialism was never able to get off the ground in the U.S. was that the poor in America regard themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I love that phrase. You know, my ship is going to come in next year. You'll see. I'll win the lottery, or I'll make it big with my little company that I'm starting. So the notion that this poverty is just temporary, you know. The Occupy movement, as far as I could make out, wanted to restore the American dream, when in fact the dream needs to be abolished once and for all. Naomi Klein then provides us with a list of 6 changes that must occur for this new paradigm to come into being, including reining in corporations, ending the cult of shopping, and taxing the rich. I found myself writing good luck in the margins of much of this discussion. These things are not going to happen. And what we probably need instead is a series of major conferences on why they won't happen. In fact, Clark would be a good place to hold those, you know. But part of the answer is already embedded in her essay. Vested interests in both the economic and psychological sense have every reason to maintain the status quo. And as I said, so does the man or woman in the street. What would our lives be without shopping, without the latest technological toy. Really, pretty empty, at least in the United States. How awful that capitalism has reduced human beings to this. In terms of recommendations, then, Klein's essay is rather weak. But it offers something very important by way of analysis, and also by implication. Namely, that everything is related to everything else. Psychology, the economy, the environmental crisis, our daily mode of living, the dumbing down of America, the pathetic fetish over cell phones and electronic gadgets, the crushing debt of student loans, the farce of electoral politics. I like to say Rom Mitney. I wrote Mitt Romney, but I like to say Rom Mitney. Rom Mitney's haircut. Mr. Obama's rather rapid conversion from liberal hero to war criminal and shredder of the Bill of Rights. Make no mistake about it. The huge popularity of violent movies, the attempt of the rich to impose austerity measures on the poor, the well-documented epidemics of mental illness and obesity, these are ultimately not separate spheres of human activity. They are interconnected, and this means that these things will not get fixed piecemeal. New civilizational paradigm means it's all or nothing. There is no diet cheesecake to be had. Okay? As Klein says, it's not about single issues anymore. What then can we expect as the arc of capitalism comes to a close? And as I say, it's happening right now. For some of you, it'll happen right in your lifetime. This is where she shifts from unlikely recommendations to hard-nosed reality. She writes, "The corporate quest for scarce resources will become more rapacious, more violent. Arable land in Africa will continue to be grabbed to provide food and fuel to wealthier nations. Drought and famine will continue to be used as a pretext to push genetically modified seeds, driving farmers further into debt. We will attempt to transcend peak oil and gas by using increasingly risky technologies to extract the last drops, turning ever larger swaths of our globe into sacrifice zones. We will fortress our borders and intervene in foreign conflicts over resources, or start those conflicts ourselves. Free market climate solutions, as they are called, will be a magnet for speculation, fraud, crony capitalism, as we are already seeing with carbon trading and the use of forests as carbon offsets. And as climate change begins to affect not just the poor, but the wealthy as well, we will increasingly look for techno-fixes to turn down the temperature with massive and unknowable risks. As the world warms, the reigning ideology in the United States that tells us that it's everyone for themselves, that victims deserve their fate, and that we can master nature, will take us to a very cold place indeed. To put it bluntly, the scale of change required cannot happen without implosion of the current system, massive implosion. This was true at the end of the Roman Empire, it was true at the end of the Middle Ages, and it's true today. In the case of the Roman Empire, as I discuss in the book Twilight of American Culture, there was the emergence of monastic orders that began to preserve the treasures of Greco-Roman civilization. And my question in that book was something along the lines of, can something similar happen today? Naomi writes, "The only wild card is whether some countervailing popular movement will step up to provide a viable alternative to this grim future. That means not just an alternative set of policy proposals, but an alternative worldview to rival the one at the heart of the ecological crisis, this time embedded in interdependence rather than hyper-individualism, reciprocity rather than dominance, and cooperation rather than hierarchy." She believes that the Occupy Wall Street movement, remember, when she wrote this, it was pretty vigorous last November, embodies this, and that they've taken aim at the underlying values of rampant greed and individualism that created the economic crisis, while embodying radically different ways to treat one another and relate to the natural world. So, is this true? 4 things to consider at this point. The first is, I have to admit, I never went down to Zuccotti Park. I live in Mexico. I wasn't going to get there. But most of what I saw on the web, including very favorable reportage of the Occupy movement, seemed to suggest that the goal was a more equitable American dream, not the abolition of the American dream. In other words, the basic demand was that the pie be cut up more fairly. I never had the impression that the protesters were saying that the pie in toto was rotten. This reminds me of an anecdote. Again, I'm not sure of the historical accuracy, but it's told about Martin Luther King, who apparently said to Harry Belafonte just before he was assassinated, that is King, not Belafonte, that he thought he might have been making a big mistake, that he sometimes felt like he was herding people into a burning church. This is a very different insight than the notion, for example, that black people should be getting a larger share of the pie. After all, who wants a larger share of a rotten pie? Who wants to live in a church that's burning down? Secondly, the Annales historians, along with the world systems analysis thinkers, have been accused of projecting an image of history without people. In other words, these schools tend to see individuals as somewhat irrelevant to the historical process, which they analyze in terms of historical forces. There is some truth to that, but historical forces can become a bit mystical. Just as it is forces that motivate people, so it is people that enact or manifest those forces. I mean, someone has to do something in order for history to happen. And at least the Occupy crowd was trying to throw sand on the wheels of the machine, as have their counterparts in Europe. But I confess that for a number of reasons, I was never optimistic, very optimistic about the movement, at least not as it existed in the United States. I've said it before, America has no real socialist tradition, and it's no surprise that the serious maldistribution of wealth that exists in the U.S. is no issue whatsoever in the coming presidential election. They're not going to be mentioning that at the debates. Americans don't care about that. In fact, a recent poll, this is March 2nd, by the Pew Charitable Trust, revealed that most Americans have no problem at all with the existence of a small, very wealthy class. They just want to be able to join it. Which takes us back to the quote from John Steinbeck, My own prediction several months ago was that Occupy Wall Street would turn into a kind of permanent teach-in, where the disaffected could go to learn about a new civilizational paradigm, if that would indeed be taught. This is basically what I call the new monastic option in the Twilight book. On one level, it's probably innocuous. It's not like it threatens the power elite. But that may not be the whole story, especially in the long run. After all, as the system collapses, alternatives are going to become increasingly attractive. And you can be sure that 2008 is not the last crash we're going to live through, by a long shot. The two sides go hand in hand. And ultimately, I'm talking 30 to 40 years, but maybe less, the weight of the arc of capitalism will be too onerous to sustain itself. In the long run, one is far smarter betting on the alternative worldview than on capitalism. So David Ehrenfeld writes, our first task is to create a shadow economic, social, and even technological structure that will be ready to take over as the existing system fails. And that's an interesting question. I'll return to that in a second. Thirdly, what then is the alternative worldview, the new civilizational paradigm? In Why America Failed, I lay out, unsurprisingly enough, the reasons for why America failed, and I say it was primarily because throughout our history, we marginalized the voices that were critical of the dominant culture, a culture based on hustling, aggrandizement, economic and technological expansion. The alternative tradition, which exists in the United States, can be traced from Captain John Smith in 1616 to Jimmy Carter in 1979, and it included folks like Emerson, Thoreau, Lewis Mumford, Jane Jacobs, Vance Packard, John Kenneth Galbraith, among many others. In England, it's particularly associated with John Ruskin and William Morris, who argued for the need for organic communities with a spiritual purpose, for work that was meaningful rather than mind-numbing, and who did manage to acquire a large number of American disciples. In a forthcoming book by a colleague of mine, Joel Magnuson, it's entitled The Approaching Great Transformation. It'll be released in March. The author states that we need concrete models of a post-carbon economy, ones that break with the profit model of capitalism and not in cosmetic or theoretical ways. In other words, Ben and Jerry's would not be the model here. Okay, and he gives a number of examples in the book of experiments in this vein. The crucial thing for me is, and Joel and I have gone back and forth in discussions and email about this, what are we really talking about? Are these steady state, no growth, non-profit, homeostatic economies, or are they Greenzo? Are they Ben and Jerry's? Are they the attempt to do the same thing but in hip language? Because frankly, there's plenty of that around. The Nation ran this ad just a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was wonderful, It's a conference called Sustainable Investing, So it's got all the chic language, And of course, is sponsored by Deep Pockets Chopra, So the topics are things like make money and make a difference. Capitalism for a democratic society. Money talks. Tell it to change the world, And you know what you can get? A $200 discount if you subscribe to the Nation. What must the cost be if you don't subscribe to the Nation? A $200 discount, This is the kind of stuff, the kind of Greenzo stuff that you see that is around, and when you look at the fine print, it turns out it's characters like Chopra, and the bottom line is you'll make money, But it's so green and it's so hip, Alternatives that are real. That's what Joel and I have been experimenting with or investigating. And he looks at things that are really homeostatic in nature. They're not about creating profit for the company, but paying the employees, and then the money goes for projects in the community. It's not about, conquering the world with Starbucks. I lived in Seattle when it consisted of one little stand. They used to make good coffee in those days. It's kind of bitter now. Interesting article I ran across, if you want to look it up, commondreams.org, August 28th. This is about Spain. And it's, Spain is going through a tremendous austerity crunch, as you know, with demonstrations in the streets and the rich essentially telling the poor, hey, you're going to eat it. The president, Rajoy, pays off the banks and people starve. He doesn't care. The experiments include things like instead of using money, exchanging time. In other words, I provide a service for so much time, then I get that in exchange. The goal of these groups, and fascinating to me, was that there are 325 of them now operating in Spain. That's a lot. That's a lot. Alternative currency systems outside of the euro. Alternative practices that exist outside of capitalism. Catalonia, of course, where now we're talking about the possibility of secession, because Catalonia was always, different language and so on. But they have a local currency now that doesn't use the euro. So these 325, the article says, represents one of the largest experiments in social money in modern times. This isn't about being cool or hip. This is getting serious now. In other words, got to leave capitalism behind if we're going to survive. Magnuson writes, the problem is that permanent growth means permanent crisis. The United States has believed that growth was the solution to everything. So we had the crash of 29, the crash of 2008, we're going to have the crash of 2014, which is going to be even more powerful. There's no end to it. There's no end to it. As I've put it elsewhere, our job now is to dismantle capitalism before it dismantles us. Again, this does not mean taking on Wall Street, which I don't believe can succeed, but it does mean leaving the field. One possibility is outright secession. There is, for example, a very powerful secessionist movement in Vermont that is called the Second Vermont Republic, and they just frankly want to leave the Union. They don't see anything beneficial about it. Vermont has a different set of values. Let's go. Let's hit the road. I don't think that's quite viable right now. I think if they declared Vermont independence, the Marines would be in downtown Burlington in about 2 hours. But in 30 or 40 years, the United States may not be able to put out every fire, and there are going to be lots more fires. there is the possibility, at least, of living in a different way. And my guess is that the dual process, so to speak, the disintegration of capitalism that we're witnessing, and the concomitant emergence of alternative socioeconomic formations is going to be the central story for the rest of this century. And I suspect that austerity will be part of this, because as capitalism collapses and we run out of resources, petroleum in particular, what choice will we have, really? Fourth and finally, this does not, it seems to me, necessarily a return to some type of feudalism, although that could well happen for all I know. But we're finally talking about the passing not only of capitalism, but of modernity in general, which would include socialism. The waning of the modern ages. In her interesting biography of the Hegelian scholar Alexandre Kojève, Shadra Jury writes, "Every political order, no matter how grand, is doomed to decay and degenerate. As for modernity in particular," she writes, "modernity's inception and its decline are like those of any other set of political and cultural ideals. In its early inception, modernity contained something good and beguiling. It was a revolution against the authority of the church, its taboos, repressions, inquisitions, and witch-burning. It was a new dawn of the human spirit, celebrating life, knowledge, individuality, freedom, and human rights. It bequeathed to man a sunny disposition on the world and on himself. The new spirit fueled scientific discovery, inventiveness, trade, commerce, and the artistic explosion of great splendor. But as with every new spirit, modernity has gone foul. Modernity lost the freshness and innocence of its early promise because its goals became inflated, impossible, and even pernicious. Instead of being the symbol of freedom, independence, justice, and human rights, it has become the sign of conquest, colonialism, exploitation, and the destruction of the earth. You all know this. You all know this is the history of the last 500 years. There's no doubt about it. In a word, capitalism's number is up. And it's our fortune or misfortune, as I said before, to be living during a time of very large and very difficult transition. An old way of life dies, a new one eventually comes into being. Of this, the poet Mark Strand remarks, "No need to rush. The end of the world is only the end of the world as you know it." For some reason, I find that thought rather comforting. Thank you. Thanks very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Could you describe more about the alternative societies that you and your colleague have been coming up with, and maybe specifically Mark Montgomery's place for artists for these societies? Like, does that go off?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk in Aguascalientes in Mexico. And it's just a couple hours from where I live. And it was educators mostly, a couple hundred people. And that question came up again and again. They wanted to know where the arts fit into this. They really, really, and I understand that. And the real problem is, I mean, they want to know what's the role of art. I mean, it's a long debated question, of course. What's the role of art in social change and so on? And, you know, the thing is that I don't feel that art myself has to be directed to political ends. In fact, it can always be twisted out of shape if that's done. So, you know, we have Pablo Neruda writing about the United Fruit Company. Okay, that's all right. But the real revolutionary potential of art is simply to speak the truth. That's the real revolutionary potential, that in any context, whether it's socialist or capitalist or anything, you know, there's such a thing as green fascism, after all. Whatever it is, it's to simply say what the truth is. And that's its explosive potential. And frankly, if I felt it had any role in this evolution that we're talking about, I would say it's to keep us honest. You know, that to me is the function of it. As far as these alternate experiments, I have to be honest with you, I've read that manuscript only once. Joel wanted me to read it to act as substantive editor, and I read it only once, and so he's working on it now. But I do remember that I had some problems because and I wrote him about this. I said, you know, some of the examples that you're mentioning, if you read a little more closely, they're still talking about profit. So in the book, if you're going to talk about moving to a homeostatic, you know, non-growth kind of culture, you've got to make it clear that we need experiments that don't do that, that don't use a hip language, but when you read the fine print, it's about, you know, lining your pockets. And so he's working on that. And frankly, I mean, there were about 3 or 4 names, that when I read through seemed to qualify, that really, you know. But I can't remember offhand what they are. The book is called The Approaching Great Transformation. The author is Joel Magnuson. It will be published by 7 Stories Press next March, and you can decide for yourself, you know. But meanwhile, you know, frankly, you can find, I mean, that thing I found about Spain on the net was practically by accident that I ran across it. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff out there. It's just that, you know, the question to ask is, what are they really doing? That's the important thing. Sarah?
Let me just interject there that the transition towns movement, which I was telling you about yesterday,
right.
is a really powerful movement in Britain that also has a number of towns that are involved in it here. So just Google transition towns and you'll find a plethora of information. A great book. The man who's spearheading it is Rob Hopkins, and they are on the money, I think, in terms of their process.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any way at all that you think America has succeeded? And if so, what is it?
Jazz. Hollywood. It provided a haven for immigrants such as my parents to escape religious persecution. At least down until 1924, when quota laws came into force with great vigor. But one side of my family came across in 1920 and the other in 1921, just before the curtain dropped. So there was a haven for people who were persecuted. If it didn't really carry out the promise of democracy, and I don't think it did, it nevertheless projected the ideal of it. And I think it's important to have that. The notion that, I mean, we don't have the Bill of Rights. 8 out of the 10 amendments have now been shredded. You don't have freedom of speech and so on anymore. But there are only 2 left, the right to bear arms, and I think the other is the right to arm bearers or something like that. But there are only 2 left. No, one is the right to bear arms, and the other is standing armies. You don't have to put up with standing armies in your house. The other 8 don't exist anymore. But at least they projected the notion of a society in which, you won't be thrown in jail for your beliefs or persecuted and so that kind of thing. It's not happening. Now the Muslim community is being pretty heavily persecuted in the United States, but for a long time, at least that shown as an ideal. The other success, but I would put it in quotes, is that culturally, America has been very successful in projecting its value system. I mean, this is why I think its success is really a failure, but it's projecting its value system worldwide. For example, the number 1 television program in the Gaza Strip is Friends. So here you have all these people sitting around who absolutely detest the United States, watching Friends and thinking it's cool. There's something remarkably successful, I mean, also horrible, but remarkably successful in being able to do that. Somebody else? Yeah, sir.
So your whole premise is that capitalism will die because it's this recent system, but sort of a greed and taking things based economy has been around as long as human history. And I'm wondering what exactly you're seeing that indicates to you that this system will come to an end and not that some form of, not necessarily capitalism, but a greed and stealing and I think you used, I don't remember the word you used,
Well,
economy won't come back after this disaster you're talking about, because
Right.
I feel like human nature is to steal from each other and to sort of.
Right. You would then need to read a lot of anthropology to correct that impression, because it's just not true. However, I am not talking simply about aggression. Aggression goes back to the Stone Age. I don't have a problem with that. I'm talking about the nature of a certain type of economy, a certain type of socioeconomic formation. And that formation is only a few hundred years old. So when you look at, I got this, I was on some television, radio interview, and the guy was saying, well, what about the Mongol hordes? And I said, they were into barter. We're not talking about capitalism here. So be clear, I'm not talking about the simple fact of aggression, which seems to be a constant of human life for millennia at least. But I'm talking particularly about an economic formation that has the notion of expansion at its center. That didn't exist for Mongol hordes. Barter is not an economic system based on expansion. The notion of an ever-expanding economy without limits is fairly recent, And as a result of which, the last few hundred years look like some weird speeded-up version of the timeline of human nature. In other words, if you take factors like the consumption of natural resources and you have a timeline like this, it's sort of like this for about 40,000 years, and then the last 400 it's like this. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about, not merely the aggressive part of human nature, which I agree with you is very, very old. Yes, sir.
I think a lot of what we think of as like when we talk about human nature are really dysfunctional expressions of our natural instincts. And because have divorced ourselves from nature, we don't know how to be normal. I think any new cultural efflorescence has to include an evolutionary model, but first, I think, a therapeutic model.
You want to say more about that? I'm trying to get a handle on what you mean by therapeutic model.
That there's just what you were saying. There's something wrong with us, the way we function, and that's why we don't have a culture. Because I believe that we've been dumbed down on purpose, and right now the middle class has been set adrift because the top 1% doesn't need us anymore. One of the alarm bells that went off for me was a little internal memo that Michael Moore, his Capitalism, A Love Affair, he put up this little thing from Citicorp.
Capitalism, A Love Story.
Yeah, and it was basically this letter from this a fund manager, something to his clients, saying that you can invest in stuff, basically companies that sell only to the rich, because that's where all the money, that's the economy can continue on by itself. Doesn't need the middle class, doesn't need our consumerism, that there's enough money in the upper 1%, they can just spend it on what they want, and that'll keep their economy going. And we're just like, left with a shit pile, like Chris Hedges showed in his book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt.
The reason I asked you about the therapeutic thing, the reason I wanted you to elaborate on that was that there's something entwined with the issue of human psychology and how that gets capitalized on in the modern era. Many years ago,
I meant by the evolutionary model.
Partly.
Model, and we're in a state of arrested development, and because of that, we sort of backslide. We go into our darker sides to satisfy those unmet needs.
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. I was just thinking of another part. Years ago, I wrote a book called Wandering God, which tried to talk about the last 100,000 years, and that human beings are wired in a certain way to as they enter the world physically, as they're born, and the couple of years that follow that, there is the awareness that comes into focus of the other and the fear of the other. And that there are ways that that fear can be mitigated, which I believe was the case in many, not all, hunter-gatherer societies, carrying the child on the body for 4 years, for example, prolonged breastfeeding, lots of things that we could point to. Or a society that separates the child at birth, shoves it in a crib, and sticks a computer toy in with it. And, and then the child, basically you have the raising of a child that is terrified of the world and therefore has to conquer the world in order to feel safe, which is the United States pattern. That's the American pattern. And the colossal destruction of that and the endless creation of shadow battles, so that if we're not fighting communism, we then have to shift to terrorism, And we can do these little dances of, this latest anti-Islamic film is released, everybody gets excited and it fills the news. Next week nobody will be talking about it, we'll be on to some other kind of caca, and this endless kind of cycle, because there's no recognition of that primal fear and how we're going to deal with it in society. Obviously, that would be another lecture. And, historians are notorious windbags. I could stay here for 12 hours. Yes, sir.
The discussion also made me think of theology as a core part of these issues. My ancestors were Puritans, and let me apologize for that. I'm sorry about that.
Well, there's some good Puritans.
But we brought that from Europe as part of our Christian heritage, and it was so oppressive to the human spirit. I mean, I can see why people wanted to run off in their own little individual things, because it was so oppressive. And I was introduced to Catholicism in high school, and that whole innate depravity of original sin thing really didn't make me feel much better about myself either. So I think theologically we've been taught that because Adam and Eve ate a piece of fruit, we're separate from nature, we're separate from each other, we're separate from divinity. I think that creates a real sense of alienation, a sense of being lost. Mm-hmm. And so a part of that, if there's going to be a therapeutic approach, I think it would be to take a look at the core theological issues that we have replicated in this country, and how we can switch from a traditional savior, Jesus coming, to communism will save us, or socialism will save us, and free markets will save us. And really what we kind of said is this necessity to be comfortable with the other, be comfortable in your own skin and life, and be comfortable with ambiguity as I think as a kind of a core sense of being an adult, being a kind of sane human being who can say, I don't know. Isn't it a nice question? Isn't this painting beautiful? So in terms of art, does it open you to yourself? Does it speak to our commonality? It doesn't have to make a political point. In fact, most of those unnerve me. They make me uncomfortable because I get up in my head and I start fighting a battle. But can it open me to something? And when you wrote in a question of values, the painting in Mexico, all the bright colors, you don't need to put anything on the wall because it's colored. Everything has color. And here we are in New England, and there's a lot less of that, if any. So anyway, I try to bring all these issues back to a core question of theology. Yeah. And I think theology can mitigate human limitation, or I think theology can exacerbate human limitation. And I think that your books, Coming to Our Senses, was just an eye-opener. And if anyone has never read that, please try to get a copy. And I think that book was the one that really made me focus even more on theology as the central way in which we learn how to relate our own bodies to each other and to the world around us. And if we can change.
Yeah, it's religious systems that then define thought systems. And so, so you can say, let's say communism is secular, but it's not really. So it's that kind of thing. But as you're talking, I just have a quote here from, seems relevant, from Human, All Too Human by Nietzsche. If one is something, one doesn't really need to do anything, and yet does a great deal. There you are. Sir.
Thanks for a really thought-provoking talk. If I could sneak in a comment of this gentleman whose name I don't know, somebody who has a couple of nice little assuaging remarks to make about Protestantism is Bob Neville down at BU has a book, A Puritan Smile, which you might want to check out. And I find particularly helpful on the religious issues Stanley Hauerwas. You could start with his essay on how not to be a Christian and an American. He's quite hip to these things. I want to go back to your remark about when you referred to Hartz and his idea of fragmentary society.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the reasons, it seems to me, I've said this, why Europe, they didn't have the same kind of debate we have had and are still having about healthcare, because they have a feudal past, they have more of a social solidarity sense in their DNA that's carried over from that longer history, and we lack that. But of course, capitalism tends to make fragmentary societies out of societies that were not fragmentary, and so that's breaking down in Europe. And I want to ask you where we might look, maybe other than William Morris and the craft guild tradition, which I'm quite with you on that. But where might we look for antibodies? Where are some fragments of older traditions as we look to these interstices to try to find, this new this new monastic order that we might build in the shadows? Alistair McIntyre, for example, looks to Catholicism. He thinks the social tradition there has enough in it that to sustain us going forward. Where Deng Xiaoping spoke eloquently, if I may say, in the 80s, Maoism plus some market forces, somehow that there's a way of taming it.
Through Confucianism.
Well, Confucianism is more Lee Kuan Yew and others, although now China's trying it, and that failed miserably. So it seems to be failing miserably. What of these older traditions might provide us some antibodies going forward?
Frankly, I don't think we have them. The thing that's really remarkable about the United States is that it's the only country on the surface of the planet that was born bourgeois. It does not have any feudal tradition. As a result, it does not have a tradition of noblesse oblige, and that you're supposed to help other people. It doesn't have that.
We had the social gospel for a while.
Oh, we had the Wobblies for a while, too. All of that never really made it. And it's because it is so... I'll get to you in a minute, sir. It's because it's so alien to the mainstream. The thing that was exciting and dynamic and that charged the United States from a very early point was there are no limits and you can make it on your own. And that just flies in the face of reality, finally, and that's the wall we're hitting.
I accept the macro point, but I love the Wobbly Songbook. From what can we draw sustenance? You mentioned Morris.
This really is the question, and I don't know if the United States can do it. When I see Spain coming up with all these experiments, I'm aware of a long lineage, of a Catholic history and so on and so forth. The United States, I think, historically will be known for this particular model and its egregious power and its inability to finally sustain it. That's historically what will be known. And, of course, it's going to look very different written by a Chinese historian, let's say, than by Theodore Sorensen or Arthur Schlesinger or something like that. So, yes, I know you had an urgent question.
I think in developmental terms, I think if you skip a stage, you have to go back and do it.
Uh-huh.
And I think maybe our feudal stage is in our future.
Oh, interesting.
But in light of that, I was reading a lot about the Cathars lately. And they were a small group in the Languedoc area of southern France and northern Italy. And they were basically a dualist Gnostic sect. But because they thought that the material world was basically evil. And they were imprisoned in these bodies, and all they wanted was liberation into the world with a good God and the like. But because of that worldview, they had a certain disdain for material things. They were not materialistic, even though the Prudentes, who were the...
Is there a question here?
Oh.
Do you have a question?
Well, I was sort of like, he was asking for a model.
Yeah, why don't you talk after? Okay. Yeah, fell in the back.
You spoke a lot about how certain people, well, especially about how the people who tend to try and criticize and self-examine American society are marginalized, sort of. What about some people like George Carlin who are known for saying things such as, they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. There are some people, it seems like, who did get somewhat of a following in terms of...
Carlin is wonderful, and frankly, it's a tragedy that he's dead, but you can see some of his nightclub routines or whatever on YouTube. I mean, they're online, and they're really worth looking up. They're very funny. And this is a guy who, let's just say, didn't mince words. I mean, he really put it on the line. But the thing is that, in a certain sense, coming at it as a comedian, like Jon Stewart or Stuart Colbert or so on, that blunts the whole thing. It's like, yeah, but in the end, I'm really pro-America, and this is all great. And so, I mean, there's a way of blunting that criticism because it's done in a good spirit of humor. I do not have a good spirit. Okay? I am not interested in making a joke out of this. And I just want to say it like it is. And that, once you do that, you cannot get an audience. It simply is not going to happen. It's kind of funny for me, when Dark Ages America appeared, the second in the trilogy, there was a German edition, a German translation. It was reviewed in the Berliner Tageszeitung, one of the major newspapers in Berlin. A German friend clipped it, sent it to me. And the thing that I found so striking about this was the title. The title of that review was The Hopes of a Patriot. And the thing that it said was, the only hope there is for the United States is to start listening to people that are making fundamental critiques of the United States. The fact is, Dick Cheney is one of the greatest traitors that ever existed. And I am America's best friend. It just doesn't know it. It never will. But basically, if you want to follow the country down a rabbit hole of hell, Dick Cheney, who I'm convinced was psychotic, this would be a great way to go. On the other hand, if you want to start, if there's any hope for the country, it means addressing these unconscious programs and these fundamental, problems that we have. That is not going to happen in the United States. It's simply not going to happen. And I have written 3.5 books on the U.S., and frankly, that's enough. Woman in the back, yeah.
I have sort of like a several-part question. The first
a 7-part question?
No, several. Kind of consolidated.
It's very biblical. I like it. Okay.
First of all, just how did you come to the number of 30 to 40 years for capitalism to collapse? It just seems very specific, so I was wondering how you got to that. Yeah,
it was kind of interesting because at the secessionist conference that I was at in Vermont a few days ago, somebody took me aside and said, it's probably going to happen in a few weeks. And I said, I've hung around with left-wing groups long enough to know that revolution is always around the corner. It's just always around the corner. And somehow we never get there, but it's just about to break, And frankly, it's pretty arbitrary in the sense that, part of it is that the estimate for peak oil is about 20 years. And so the point at which we're just, we're at the tail end of this and are just going to run out of resources. Just look around. Stuff that's made out of oil, petroleum, all that's going to disappear. What are we going to do? Make it out of feathers? So it's sort of like this would be a major factor in it. And the other thing is that given the fact that the response to the crash of 2008 was to do exactly what we had been doing before the crash. In fact, the manufacture of CDOs, credit default swaps, and derivatives is now far more aggressive than it was prior to the crash of 2008, and that was what caused the crash. The fact that our president, in his infinite wisdom, another example of being chic on the outside and empty on the inside, appoints Lawrence Summers, Timothy Geithner, Ben Bernanke. That's appointing the fox to guard the henhouse. And so how long will it be until the system implodes again? And finally, there will come a time where there is no recovery. There's no, the bailout of that. Actually, Nomi Prince, my friend in L.A., Nomi Prince wrote me that the actual amount that was transferred to banks, hold your hats, was $19 trillion. Even the Iraq War only cost about $1 trillion. Only $1 trillion. So I think that talking about 40 may actually be the far end of it. It might be a lot more likely than 20. But it's just a kind of semi-educated guess. I can't, when I went to graduate school, it was in history, not in prophecy. So I don't really have a crystal ball. It's just the best educated guess. Now, moving on to the second part of the 7 questions.
This will be the only next one.
Only one more part? Oh, okay.
I guess just I feel like at this point, our culture has cultivated us to be kind of useless in the way of basic practical skills of life, making food from the ground up, for instance. And do you think that's going to be an issue? And where are we going to get these models of new economics? Are they going to come from experts that have sort of generated them in their minds, or is it going to be from indigenous cultures, or I don't know, because just where is it going to come from? Because we're still part of this tradition. We don't have an alternative to go to in our mind.
Right, but as far as that goes, I mean, as opposed to the question this gentleman asked over here about real alternatives, as far as that goes, certainly going back to the 17th, 18th century on the American continent, there was the Yankee can-do from scratch mentality. Tinkering with stuff, and all that does exist in our historical experience. The fact that I guess most kids believe that meat grows in packages covered with cellophane, that's going to have to quickly be redressed. But I think that as the crunch comes down, local communities, such as they exist, have a much better chance of exchanging that information. I live in Mexico. I live in a small town in Mexico, and this is so alive there. This sort of thing is so alive there. It's really impressive. I have a mechanic who sometimes fixes my house when something falls down and stuff like that. And I remember he and I were drinking coffee once in a cafe, and he said, there's this particular plant out in the desert, just a couple of hours from here, and if you touch it, you die. He told me the name and what it looks like, so you want to be careful. Thanks a lot, I'm going to go around in a bodysuit from now on. I said, Rafa, how do you know this? He said, my father told me, and his father told him. That existed in the United States, So reconstructing that, but again, it's going to be out of necessity, not out of virtue. There will be just no alternatives. Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions. The first, you cited Native Americans quite a lot. I'd be interested if there's some ideas there that could contribute to potential solutions. And the other question is what the effect and role of the academy will be in this whole process.
Oh boy. Wow. What's the role of the academy, the university, in this whole process? As far as Native American goes, I was just referring to that Donner Party thing, and whether that, we did such a fabulous job of basically massacring them and exterminating them. I don't know who's left, and and if you go to Gallup, basically a lot of Indians just stumbling around drunk, and nevertheless there are Native American communities in the United States, and whether that can be recaptured, or they'll come to the fore or something like that. Certainly there's a lot of native healing that's practiced in the United States. It's just under the ground. Curanderos. So, but I don't know. It's very hard for me to predict. As far as the academy goes, that's a hard thing to say, but it's played a curious role in the sense that the ideal of it was the Enlightenment tradition. That was the central governing ideal. And as Naomi Klein says, central to that vision was the notion of progress. And So that, I think, has to be given up, and I think that's going to be very hard for university personnel to think in terms of. Jackson Lears, who teaches at Rutgers, wrote many years ago that the problem is that this idea of progress spans the entire political spectrum. Whether you read The Nation or the National Review, they believe in it. And so it doesn't matter. And a much more likely possibility is that we've run progress to the ground, and in particular, we need to redefine it. And so finally, this will not come as a shock to you, I would have to say, I mean, I've taught in, I can't remember how many universities now. And my experience is there are professors and there are professors. And it depends on who's doing what and what they're modeling for as a student. I remember, took my first academic job at Rutgers in 1970, and I don't know where I was coming from, but I thought we were going to sit around talking about ideas at lunch, and stuff like that. And so there we were in the faculty dining room, and they're talking about who's sleeping with the dean's wife and merit increments, and I'm jealous of you, and all this sort of thing. And I thought to myself, I mean, wow. I mean, what in the world have I walked into? And I remember one of the graduate students in the department, when I was talking about this, said to me, look, for most of these folks, it's just ham and eggs and paying off their mortgages. Now, one might be able to say that of any profession, frankly, whether it's architects or street cleaners or something like that. One might be able to say that of any profession. But the thing is that the only thing, again, it's like art. The only thing that you can do for your students is model the person who genuinely cares about that subject. That's the revolutionary power of the Enlightenment tradition. That you're not doing this to hustle tenure or get this and that published or something, but you know what? You really, really care about that topic. As a result of this, I didn't fit in very well. Okay, that was the problem. And that was my frustration, that for most it was just a comfortable slot. It wasn't about the significant importance. Whether it's medieval Latin verse, it's still okay with me. It's just where I want to see what can you model for the students, this deep concern for the integrity of the topic. If that can last through this, that's a contribution enough, as far as I can guess. Yeah.
I was just thinking, could they teach embodiment? Could they teach a way of being honest and navigating the human experience? Is that what you're saying? Is the professors that had the most impact on me loved what they were doing because they lived it. It wasn't a bunch of concepts in their head. They loved it. It was a passion, and it came through as being utterly embodied. And that, more than anything, that's what Native Americans did for their kids. They modeled how they were going to live. Is there a way to, I don't know, you talk about a methodology of navigating experience. And
I don't know, but to me, the one methodology I can think of, it always comes down to this, and I guess I was saying it to this gentleman without using the word, is apprenticeship. That's the heart of it. That was what the University of Bologna in the year 1000 was about. And, Gary Snyder has this wonderful poem called Axe Handles, where he describes how he teaches his son how to make an axe. And he says, he's an axe and I'm an axe, and this is how we go on, And so the fact that you could model for young people what it is to care about this sort of thing, try to do it through distance learning. What a joke. What a joke that is, And everybody gets excited. Oh, we're going to transform the world. Yeah, no doubt about it, So, But finally, you have to be a physical body that says, this counts for me, and I'm going to tell you why. If you can do that, then you've been a successful academic, as far as I'm concerned. Yes, sir.
Yes. You mentioned Mexico a little bit. I was wondering about the ways that your work is received there, and also along those lines about the use of the word America in your titles and your lectures, when there's this long-standing tradition of reclaiming the word for the rest of the continent.
Yeah, I've talked with my editor in Mexico City about this a lot, and basically, looking around, his conclusion is that the word America can be used to refer to the United States, and that That's okay even in Chile, Argentina, and so on. But the word American cannot. That if you say, once you say Americano, so once you do that, then you are referring to the northern tier of Mexico down to Tierra del Fuego. It's the whole thing. So that's how he handles it, making that distinction, you know. Although if you're talking about an individual, estadounidense is the word that's most typically used. So you know, that's basically how we get around that. And the other question you had was how it's received, how the work is received. Well, I don't get, for some shocking reason, I don't get many invitations to speak in the United States. I mean, I can't figure that out. Why would that be? But I speak very frequently in Mexico and occasionally in other parts of Latin America. And frankly, having been victimized by the United States for so long in so many ways, this stuff just isn't shocking to Latinos. Not at all. They know the story. They've been the target of it. And so it's just not, the thing that they're concerned about, for example, might be things like, well, if there's another huge stock market crash, or if the system really goes dysfunctional in an irreparable way, what will happen to us? You know, I mean, that's legitimately, that's where their focus is. But the general, I mean, sometimes they'll ask me questions like, why aren't you censored in the U.S.? How is you even get your stuff published? I wonder myself. You know, they say, how is it that you're not censored? And I say, frankly, if you've got a nation of 314 million people and 5,000 buy a copy of my book, what's the threat? You might as well let the guy run around, you know, barking or something like that, because he ain't going to do anything, you know. I mean, the day they lock me up, and I'm not saying it can't happen, but the day they lock me up means they're really in trouble. You know? I mean, if I'm a threat, anybody is. Really, so.
Morris, let's just take one more.
Oh, okay. Woman in the back?
I have a comment and a question following up. My first comment is that I think that I have a different idea about the Occupy movement than you do.
Okay.
I was in Wall Street and Boston and Worcester and all had Occupy movements. And I would say that the majority of people that I talked to were fundamentally like disagreeing with capitalism as an idea and not just wanting to change the distribution of wealth within it. And I think that perhaps part of the reason that this idea of the Occupy movement as just distributing wealth in a new way is because of what you said, pushing anyone who's challenging the fundamentals of the system out off the radar. That's exactly what happened. Like, there'd be thousands of people at a protest and it wouldn't even be in the news. And they just ignored it, just like they would with anything else. And so it makes sense that they like aren't listening to it. And just the fact of how like NYPD would crush the protest, which wasn't reported on at all, but like the way that they would crush them means that it was a threat. Otherwise, they would have just let the protest go on. And I think that that's really telling of the power of resistance movements, but I'm curious to see what you would say about resistance movements within the end of capitalism, since it seems that you think that it'll just end on its own, and as if like we as people here don't have any agency in the change that will be created. So I'm wondering, what are the roles, in your opinion, of resistance movements?
Well, thank you. The first thing that I'd want to say about your take on the Occupy movement is, frankly, you probably know more than I do. I mean, I wasn't there. And the impressions I have, as I said, came about through very favorable reportage of the Occupy movement on various websites. Very, very pro-Occupy movement. But they never said that there was a voice, let alone a dominant voice, that was saying capitalism has to end. They said it just has to be a fairer game. And so that's where I got my impression from, but it certainly could be wrong, you know. As far as the issue of agency, I think I addressed that in the talk. In other words, that's been the criticism of the Annales School or the World Systems Analysis School, that you could be talking about his history without people, and as I said, you have to do at least something to make things happen. The tricky part of that whole thing goes back to that great line of Marx in the opening pages of the 18th Brumaire, where he says, men make their own history, but they don't make it as they want. That the result is something that's usually unplanned and is the sum total of vectors moving in different directions, really. And so, it's worth doing certain types of things, but it's hard to predict the outcome or what the impact will have. My problem, and I stated this pretty early on with the Occupy movement, was that I saw a lot of energy. I just didn't see very much analysis. And I also didn't see political organization. It seemed all horizontal. And therefore, in terms of really grasping history, so to speak, I didn't see how it could last. And when it fizzled out, I wasn't really surprised. Nevertheless, it probably won't be the last protest movement we have, any more than 2008 will be the last crash we have. And sooner or later, things might add up in a way we can't expect. But I don't personally believe in history without agents, for example. It's just that, as I say, it's not a linear process. It doesn't work out in a linear way. Okay, that was the end of it. Thank you very much.